Hello, this is Melissa Cole, curator of the Oshawa Community Museum. I'd like to thank you for joining me today for our monthly podcast. With the recent opening of our latest exhibition, Common Threads, Stories from the OCM Quilt Collection, this month's podcast will discuss the history of quilting featuring quilts from the museum's collection. Quilts are more than blankets that keep us warm. They are also more than beautiful textiles. They are objects that hold stories and histories. They hold the lives of the women who made them. Quilts can carry messages to us across time, information about what everyday life was really like for ordinary women who came before us. Made by hand, often collaboratively, using familiar materials such as scraps of clothing, quilts are both personal and communal objects. Quilting continues to be a largely home-based business and form of women's artistic expression, whether it is social, emotional, political, aesthetic, educational, or celebratory. What does the term quilt mean? The term quilt comes from the Latin word calcita, which means stuffed sack. While the origins of quilting are uncertain, the practice has been traced back to the ancient Egyptians. In the late 11th century, crusaders from the Middle East brought the quilt to Europe, and in the Middle Ages, quilted garments became popular among knights, who wore them beneath their armor. The earliest surviving bed quilt is the Tristan quilt, which was made in Sicily in 1360. This image of the Tristan quilt is courtesy of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, England. In North America, the heyday of the quilt began in the 18th and 19th century. The earliest surviving quilt in Canada is a silk patchwork coverlet with gold applique initials IN and dated 1726. It resides at the McCord Museum in Montreal, Quebec. Made in the framed medallion style, it was brought to Kingston, Ontario from England in 1850. This hand-stitched patchwork, made over 100 years before the sewing machine was invented, is the oldest dated patchwork in North America. Like other traditions, quilting techniques were brought to Canada by early settlers. Cotton and silk yard goods were imported from Europe through major seaports and were always available for a price. Women met in small groups at quilting parties and worked individually to finish quilts that were necessary to keep the family warm in cold Canadian winters. No statistics are available, but I suspect that a large majority of quilts were made or at least pieced during the long winter months when sometimes even the men in the household helped with the quilting. Most churches had women's missionary societies or sewing groups who constructed quilts as part of fundraising activities. Currently on display in the exhibit Common Threads is a quilt that was an autograph quilt featuring an embroidered picture of the South Oshawa Methodist Church. This church was established in 1910 here in Oshawa. The quilt was a fundraiser where individuals would pay a dime to have their name embroidered on the quilt. This particular quilt features 223 names. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution made manufactured cloth much more accessible, and it also marked the invention of an important quilting tool, the sewing machine. In the 1850s, singers started an installment plan, making these machines more feasible to purchase. With the rise of the sewing machine, women could devote more time to quilt making, as opposed to sewing clothing for their families, and the quilt making itself took significantly less time. This new technology, along with the new variety of colorful calicos, meant a shift in the style of quilts. A few earlier quilts had been made in block style, but these were uncommon until the 1840s, and the popularity of the style rose throughout the 19th century. The tail end of the 19th century marked the new fad for crazy quilts. These quilts were made of abstract shapes, randomly sewn together, and were often further embellished with embroidery. Here are a few other examples of patterns found amongst the quilts from the collection held at the Oshawa Community Museum. The first one here is an orange peel pattern. This one is a Carolina lily. This one features the crosses and losses pattern. And finally, the popular log cabin design. The history of quilting certainly doesn't end here. The popularity of quilting continues into the present, and it's experiencing resurgence at the fingertips of contemporary do-it-yourselfers and seamstresses. Certainly the present quilting revival that began in the 1970s, with the great number of women and men teaching quilt making and writing books and designing their own patterns, will only add greatly to the numbers. In addition, the new computer quilt design software that enables the user to design blocks and quilts will add significantly to the library of patterns available to today's quilt maker. Looking back in 20 or more years, it will be interesting to see what types of names quilt designers used during these years for their new quilt patterns. To me, old quilts are an endlessly fascinating resource of information and simply joyful to behold. I invite you to come and learn a bit more about quilts and discover the stories behind them during our exhibit, Common Threads, Stories from Our Quilt Collection, which is on display now until the end of January 2014. Thank you.